Bienvenidos todos, welcome everybody, and I am really glad because tonight we're having a very special show where we're going to talk with one of the young authors that are like have a special craft, and they take a special care incorporating different elements in the work that they are doing, and I am really glad to having as our guest tonight Zac Thompson. How are you doing, Zac?
Hello, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
It's a real pleasure, and once again, thank you very much. I know that you're really busy. You're writing for a lot of stuff, not only comic books. You're really active, and man, you're really talented. And I cannot express how much we like your work in this show and in different shows. So thank you for once again. And remember, if you in the audience have some questions, please let us know, and I will mention those questions if I think that they are actually something that can help you to develop this conversation. And also, your questions will be shown in the lower part. Greetings to Joel, who is incorporating right now from Facebook, to Florecita, she's in Twitch right now, and people in Periscope, and the different links in YouTube. So we want to talk about a very specific topic, Zac. And it's, I believe that it's one element that it's common in some of your recent work, particularly in, I don't know, in the Dregs, which I just finished reading in the, I don't know, like the last week, and I really love. And the way that you are expressing and adding elements of horror, elements of suspense, elements where you are just thinking where the story is going and creating this feeling in the audience, is something that I really admire. Can you tell us a little bit about the inspiration or where the inspiration come for you to write titles like Coming to Me or The Dregs?
Yeah, I think for me it came from the place of like just trying to write comics that I really wanted to read, but more over than that, it was about using horror to kind of explore social themes and talk about things that you know, I used to write for Vice, and something that I could write a Vice article for, that, you know, it might not resonate with them, but sometimes fiction makes us resonate with things a lot more than the average article or reporting of the news. So I thought it'd be very interesting to make a horror take on gentrification or a horror take on body image. Gentrification being the Dregs and body image being Come Into Me. Horror makes us confront the things that we're afraid to talk about as a society. And I think that when you take a social topic and you put horror into it, you get people to actually confront things that they don't typically talk about or they don't typically look at.
Exactly, and for example, in those particular cases, the most recent is, and it's actually one title that it's, I believe, right now in the issue number 2, and we're looking for the issue number 3, which I believe comes this month. In the case of Coming to Me, it's interesting because some of the reviews and some of the comments mention that it's like some sort of a Black Mirror episode, which, well, yeah, I can see why is it like that, but I like the way that you are taking it, and what makes it even more scary is the fact that you are using elements that, as you mentioned, are present. In this case, the need for communication in a different level, and also the way that a company or perhaps the person who is developing these techniques can explore it. And somehow it usually tends to backfire. Well, in stories from the Twilight Zone, it's a common reference when the creator has a particular plan, but it usually backfires. Well, also, actually, I believe that we can go back as far as going to the old Frankenstein. But in this case, in the case of communications, in Coming to Me, what elements do you see in the real world that you are criticizing or commenting in Coming to Me?
So when we originally conceived of Come Into Me, we talked a lot about our tendency to like overshare on social media and how people kind of communicate the most mundane details about themselves. And at that time, when we were conceiving of the story, Lonnie and I, the co-writer on the book, I was just moving in with my partner for the first time, and I was really feeling like there was like kind of a blurring of my privacy that I was losing, and I wasn't really used to that. It was the first time I lived with someone I was dating, and so we started to think about how you could take that to the most extreme level, what you could do when you actually gave a company access to all of your memories and all of yourself, and how far we would go to exploit that. And, you know, it's been a common topic over the last year about people giving away their data and how companies exploit that. And when you give your data to a company, they are pretty overt about the fact that they're going to exploit that information about you. And so we thought, why not blend this with a Cronenbergian kind of take on body horror and call it something really off-putting like Come Into Me, and then make it more about memory and body image. So while people think that they're going to get something about social media, or they're going to get something about, super sexual or violent, what it really is a big look at body image and the way that we kind of keep secrets from ourselves and use social media to present the best version of ourselves, and what happens when you take that filter away.
And as you mentioned, well, you mentioned a couple of things that I find really interesting. You mentioned the influence from, in this case, from Cronenberg. And yes, I remember old movies as Existence, where even the weapons are made from chicken bones, I believe. And it's something particular because you are combining elements that in science, pretty much everything looks like so bright with metal, with lights, something really clean. But you're combining, in this case, and we're seeing one of the pages of the issue number 1 here at my right, where you combine elements of that are clinical, that are medical, with this sort of not really disgusting, but different sensation, because it's the exact opposite when you are talking about gods in this case. And also, you mentioned about the way that we perceive ourselves, and it's one of the elements that are being mentioned in this series. It's what happens when we're actually looking through the eyes of other people, their own bodies, their own life, not only the bodies, and all the differences that perhaps we take for granted because we have been living with them from the beginning. I mean, if I am fat, well, I know that I am fat, but what would happen if you actually, or somebody else came to live my life, and it will be like, why is this guy, why is he not working enough? So it's something that I find really interesting here. Did you base, you and Lonnie, the echo writer for this series, did you base any of the characters in any other particular famous people, or are you just reference or characters that you are developing and creating by your own?
So Sebastian, the main character in Come Into Me, is kind of like a blend of like Max Wren from David Cronenberg's Videodrome. We wanted to take someone who was like very driven, who had like a perverse kind of like lease on life. So like the company that Sebastian runs is odd in its intentions and very invasive in what it's doing. But he doesn't see any of that. He sees that as an extension of the human form and something that everyone should be almost blessed to be a part of. And so we took that and then blended it with Leo Bloom. He's the main character from Nightcrawler, Jake Gyllenhaal's character.
Yeah.
So like that sort of idea that like he's so driven that he's unaware that what he's doing is perverse, and he's just kind of he believes himself to be a god. He's always looking for control. And so our big thing for him was making sure that he's put in a situation where he loses control, where he no longer knows how to use his technology, where he is at the mercy of someone else.
That's interesting, and actually that's one of the scariest parts when you have this kind of confrontation. Well, you mentioned part of the inspiration in these characters, and I want to move to a different series because, well, if you want to check this series, I strongly recommend it. Actually, we have a different show. I have a different show where I participate with. It's called Destripando, where we talk exclusively about comic books, and I have been recommending this title from the very beginning. Well, from issue 1, and but there are also some other titles where we find perhaps some references that are a little bit easier to locate, and I am speaking as, specifically about Her Infernal Descent. This is being published by Aftershock. And can you tell us a little bit about what is this title about, Her Infernal Descent?
Yeah, Her Infernal Descent is basically a modern retelling of Dante's Inferno. Again, co-written with Lonnie Nadler, and both him and I had very strong relationships to our mothers, and so this kind of was born out of the idea of what could we do as like a modern reimagining of hell? How could we take some of the themes that we've seen in the conventional sort of like high art depiction of hell in Dante's Inferno and reimagine them blending social media technology and sort of modern fears and modern personalities into this story. So really trying to take the themes that Dante toyed with years and years ago and making them modern.
Yeah, and obviously you can recast part of the original story, if we can say it in that way, because, well, sorry if I do the pronunciation in Spanish, because I don't recall how to say it in English. I believe Virgilio is the main guide in this case for Dante's in the original story. However, for me it was really interesting who you choose, because William Blake is a really interesting character. Well, characters in this story, but he was a really interesting artist. By his own merits in real life. Why did you guys choose William Blake as the guide of the main character?
We chose William Blake for a variety of reasons. One, because he made beautiful depictions of Dante's Inferno while he was living. Mm-hmm. Some of his art is some of the best representations of the epic poem. But on top of that, we thought that his life itself was very tragic. He was a very he was a troubled figure, and he really believed that in his art and in his poetry that there was this duality to experience, this the marriage of heaven and hell. And so he truly did believe that on the other side of the devil was God. And we wanted to take someone like that because we thought that sort of perspective would be really unique, because the modern kind of idea of what a vice is or a sin is very different from what it was when the Divine Comedy was originally written. So some of the things that would have put you into hell at that time aren't even considered like a faux pas anymore. And so we thought Blake would be a very interesting perspective to lead us through. And we also just really want to have a character that spoke in verse. So we wrote all of his dialogue in poetry.
That if you are familiar with some comic book characters, in this case in DC Vertigo, the demon, it comes to mind because, well, in this fictional universe, there's a level of demons who they are always speaking on rhyme. So it was kind of peculiar, or when I find out that some sort of the money that is being exchanged, well, it's not actually money, but some sort of value that you have in the underworld. In this case, is poetry, or at least the way that William Blake is using. Where did this idea came from?
So in Dante's Inferno, the interpretations that Lonnie and I have speaks about the word of power. And so there's a couple points in the epic poem where Virgil, Dante's guide, comments on the fact that poetry has the power to move people. It has the power to change perspective. And so we thought it'd be very interesting to have Blake teach the main character, Lynn, how to use this word of power over the course of the series. And so these characters that are aware that of Dante's Inferno, in our world, Dante's Inferno was written, and all of the characters inside of hell understand that depiction exists, but they are in defiance of it. And so this poetry is used in the first issue basically to convince Charon to let them carry them into hell, because it's the only thing that was actually able to move him and give him actual motion.
All right. We have some questions from the audience, and in this case it's from Juan Espiritu, John Spirit, and he's asking us, how was the process of adapting okay. So what elements did help you to do the adaptation of Dante's Inferno to the modern time? Because you're including obviously modern characters in this. So what elements did help you to translate them into this place?
So, I mean, when we set out to do this, it was probably way too ambitious. We took Dante's Inferno, and both Lonnie and I read it, and we compiled a bunch of notes about the things that stood out to us, the most important elements, but also the most important characters and kind of what they represented. And then we went through literature and tried to find like modern allegories for them. So the easiest thing that I can mention is in the second circle of hell, you have the judge of hell, Minos, who basically is this person who's crippled by anxiety as they're trying to make choices for what circle each person was going to go into. And Lonnie and I are huge fans of Franz Kafka. And so when we looked at Minos and Minos's role within the Inferno, we thought Kafka would be a really great allegory for this role. And so we kind of started doing that. Kafka was the first person that we knew we were going to put in here. And then from there, we chose Andy Warhol for running the level of greed, and went from there, taking modern figures that we could kind of see that if we imagined ourselves as Dante, and if we were going to write the Divine Comedy in the modern age, who are the equivalents in our society that represent these roles that he was trying to pinpoint during his time.
And it's also interesting because not all of those are people that perhaps we could associate as narcissistics, in this case, like with Andy Warhol, but more like tragic figures. And perhaps I don't need to mention who is in this particular page that we're showing, because we have an element that it's actually very relatable, very associated with this character. And it's interesting. In this case, it's issue number 3, because we're seeing a lot of how do you say it? A lot of elements exchanging hands, and these are elements that are either characteristics or very important. And obviously, it has a purpose. I'm not going to spoil it because, guys, you really need to read the series. It's really good. But for example, it's interesting because by doing this, you are exploring at least two things. One, the characters associated with the periods that they are actually located in time, but also you are exploring, in this case, the comic medium. And I want to talk a little bit about this because, for example, in this page, in this issue in particular, you are using one of the most well-known page designs, at least since the 80s. I believe that Dave Gibbons was the one who actually popularized it in Watchmen, and it has been made. I love that it has it came once again to light with your title, and Tom King is actually doing that with Mr. Miracle and one title before, Ambition, using a lot of these elements. So, did you have in mind exploring the comic medium and using these particular mediums, or how do you describe the layouts in this case for the artist to explore the comic medium for your stories?
So Dante, Her Infernal Descent is about 2 things for Lonnie and I, and Kyle, the artist. Mm-hmm. It's about the 5 stages of grief when you lose someone, and also the 9 stages of hell. So if you look at every issue of Her Infernal Descent, every single page is either 5 panels or 9 panels, and we did that specifically. And so when we script out the book, we only do 5 or 9s, and so you'll see that's a 5 there. The 9-panel grid is a really interesting way to slow down storytelling in comics, but also a really interesting way to give everything equal weight. And so when we were scripting out issue 3, we knew that Andy Warhol was going to play a big role in it. And we thought, how can we take that and represent his most famous work of art on the comic book page? And so we have 4 pages like that where there's 5 panels of trading, and then there's 4 panels in the 4 corners representing the thing that is being acquired on that page. Lonnie and I are very interested with playing with form and making sure that if we can do it, that the form complements the content of what's happening in our stories. And so more often than not, we spend way too much time planning out how our pages are going to be structured, because we think it's so important to ensure that the storytelling is enhanced by it being a comic book, and being a comic book first and foremost. And so, you will never be able, if this was ever made into a film, you'd never be able to replicate that feeling in a movie. It only exists on the page.
So, and in this case, because there have been attempts to adapt the unadaptable works in this case, well, perhaps Watchmen, we were speaking about that. You can love or hate the Zack Snyder, but he did, I believe, that better than expected adaptation, because it was something that wasn't easy to adapt. And more recently, in the case of novels, I remember Cloud Atlas, which I love the novel, but when they mentioned that the Wachowski siblings were going to adapt it to a film, I was like, how the hell are they going to work with the different stories? And once again, I believe that they actually did a way better than expected work, even if the movie didn't go as planned in the box office. But those are different aspects. So perhaps, I don't know, a young filmmaker will attempt to adapt this story to the screen. But well, that will be something that we will be looking forward in case that they try to adapt the medium. Following this topic, what is your favorite medium to write for? Comic books, novels, use regular prose, articles, something like that?
Currently, it's comics. I think that I've written one novel. I have a second written that I'm looking for a publisher for it right now. But comics is this interesting, there's some immediacy to comics. So you can work with, 2 or 3 other people, sometimes up to 5 or 6, to create something within 3 months of having an idea. You can actually have something printed and on the shelf that exists. And because it's such a tight-knit group, you can do things like those 9-panel grids that we showed in Her Infernal Descent that come from everyone coming together. That page design, we plotted that out, but Kyle brought that to life, and then our colorist D knocked it out of the park. And then even the letters from Ryan Ferrier are fantastic. All of those things come together because the team is tight-knit, and you have a vision that you set out to create. Writing a novel is a very solitary experience. You do it for a year and you don't really talk to anyone about it. And with comics, you're talking to everyone at every step of the process. You're weighing in and you're very involved. I wouldn't trade that for the world. So I want to write comics for the rest of my life.
And it's interesting because you mentioned because you're mentioning this, and yes, sometimes we as readers tend to forget that it's the work in there is done in collaboration. So you cannot have a comic book if you don't have the written word, if you don't have the main idea, the plot. But if you don't have the visual elements, and these visual elements, as you mentioned, and thank you for mentioning that, because I was forgetting, but not only the artist, but the letterist, the color, all those elements are what are creating a single work of art in this case. So it's a working collaboration that actually comes to fulfillment when all of you are working in the same page. So have you presented an element that you believe it's like sort of your signature, some element that you have used in all your different stories? Some characters, some writers usually have a reference like a number or a name or a stereotypical character perhaps in the background. So do you have this sort of element, or it hasn't come to your mind to do it?
Lonnie and I, across our work, are slowly building out subtle nods to the world that we're creating. So like in the back of issue 1 of Come Into Me, you can actually see the restaurant from the Dregs. And there's a reference to Her Infernal Descent in the last issue of Come Into Me. And there's going to be a reference to Come Into Me in the last issue of Her Infernal Descent. So we're kind of creating this thing where these worlds all exist and making nods to one another. I mean, the most signature thing, I think, is Lonnie and I are very interested in memory and how your past defines you. That's kind of synonymous across all of the projects that we're working on, and for right now, that kind of has defined the first kind of 2 years of our career. And so I think that is kind of where we're at. And 9-panel grids, there's 9-panel grids in literally everything that we do. And I love it as a storytelling device. I'm going to use it until I can't use it anymore.
And you mentioned, for example, the way that it could be hard to adapt, in this case, the work that you guys are doing, because as you mentioned, it's planned in this case for the page. It's planned to be read, to be looked at in this format. However, it's kind of interesting in this case in the Drex, and I want to move a little bit to that title, because in one of the first pages you are using something that in the 90s was kind of common, and it was the cinematographic focus, where you have like long panels that are trying to simulate a widescreen in this case. However, I was really glad because after you turn the presentation, you go to the 9 panel grid that you have in there, but you're also playing with the different elements, because it's really clever, because you have the description in this case of one character, and you are showing in the first page pretty much all the elements that will go working with the rest of the issue, with the rest of the story. You have one character that is missing, and you have the location in the reflection in this case that we are looking at the bottom panels in this case. So you mentioned a little bit about the inspiration for the Drex in this case. Do you plan to perhaps revisit this world in a different title, or besides the mentions that you're having, like from the restaurant in different titles?
We've talked about it. So Eric's moved on to a new project, but we're very close friends with Eric. We've talked to him many times about what we would potentially do next.
Mm-hmm.
We have an idea of kind of a spiritual sequel to the Dregs, but not a direct sequel. I think that we're all very happy about the way that it works so self-contained, mm-hmm. and that considering the way that it ends, it's kind of really difficult for us to like wrap our heads around what happens next, because I think that a lot of comics or a lot of stories really try to err on the side of giving you a very definitive conclusion, and they tell you this is exactly what happened. And for us, what we've been very interested in for a while now is actually taking things and making them a little bit more open to interpretation. So the Dregs kind of ends where you're not exactly sure what choice he makes in the end, without spoiling anything. And I think that I like that, because what it did is when we released that book, it made everyone who read the book have a different interpretation of what that final page meant, and they really had a different idea of what the future held for Arnold. So if we ever decided to say this is exactly definitively what happened to Arnold, I think people would be disappointed. And we have an idea that's crazy and batshit for doing a direct sequel, but we're going to hold on to it. We've talked about doing it in like 10 years' time.
Interesting. It will be a jump, and actually it will be exploring different parts. And I just want to mention, because I really love the fact that the game that you're having with some of the characters, you also start involving obviously not only the city, the different characters, the different elements that actually are, in this case the city is a different character, and how it is degrading in the way that it's actually sort of improving by the gentrification of different parts. But also I love the way that you added, in this case, elements that could be related to film noir, where you have, in this case, well, the hard detective with the femme fatale or something like that. Do you have any other references, or perhaps the inspiration came from old movies or something like that?
So the page that you have there is actually a reference to Robert Altman's The Long Goodbye. Mm-hmm. We're actually in Marlowe's apartment from The Long Goodbye, but many people don't actually notice, because it's just like we were very meticulous about the way that we created that apartment. The Dregs is filled with references to other pieces of detective fiction. And we tried very, very hard to ensure that there's little winks and nods for people who are fans of all kinds of different books and stories in that genre. And I think that in particular, we really enjoy taking genre and taking the familiar things about a particular genre and playing with them, playing with expectations, playing with what people might want to see, and then giving them something different, or when they think one thing is going to happen, beating them over the head with something else.
Yeah, because perhaps a lot of times it's kind of I don't know if disappointed when some of the elements that you are trying to communicate are like just in your face, instead of having reference and playing with them and perhaps bringing different non-expected ending. Well, it's like, well, it was obvious from the beginning, and it's actually more rewarding to the reader to have it the way that you guys have been doing it. We have more questions from the audience. Once again, Juan Espiritu is asking, what is the part that you enjoy the most when you are writing a comic book?
I think it comes down to the initial plotting. When you're building out a story, when you're building out all the different ideas of what could go into a story, that kind of feels limitless at that point. The process afterwards, like paring it down and taking all the different elements that might not work out of it, is a little less fun. But when you pick a genre, when you pick a particular sort of topic and character, and you build that out, and you just go wild and do all that research and everything, that's exhilarating, because there's really nothing that's off the table at that point. It's all the paring down afterwards that is soul crushing sometimes.
All right, yeah, and I can see why. And for example, you are writing, well, at the moment you are writing, obviously, the titles that we have been commenting, which are being published by more independent or lesser known companies. However, you are also working on the mainstream, because you are working with Marvel, also with Lonnie doing the cable books, which is kind of interesting, because I remember that Cable is one of those characters that is so 90s. And for example, when they had the relaunch, who was writing the relaunch before you guys entered? It was Robinson, James Robinson. No, well, he had a different perspective with the title, and then you guys entered, and it was like going back to the 90s, but in a good way, because you are taking once again the characters that perhaps were established, and I believe that they are kind of hard to adapt to the modern sensibilities, if we can say it in that way. However, they actually work, and you are bringing back even all the Ascani saga in the recent issues. Did you have that in mind, like going back to and bringing something from the 90s to the modern times, or it was something that just happened in the case of Cable?
I think with Cable in particular, Cable's a very, very, very 90s character. He's like the epitome of 90s Marvel. And so we really wanted to explore his origins, and we really wanted to take something that cut to the core of his character. Often Cable's involved in big like time travel capers and that kind of thing that I kind of feel way too larger than life. And so when we first came onto the character, we were like, what makes him human? What is something that a common person could connect to? Could I give this to my mom, and could she read it and see something enjoyable within it? So we went back and we went, okay, Cable is a time-traveling mutant, but he's had multiple families along the way. Let's look at those families, let's look at those relationships, and let's do a really deep cut into his history. We knew as well that this was the final 5 issues of the Cable series going in before we even wrote the first one. So we knew that if we were going to do this, we wanted to cover everything we loved about the character. So we covered the entire history.
Yeah, and okay, we're going back to perhaps lesser known companies in this case. And last week, I believe it was released #1 for Relay, and I want to talk a little bit about this title because, well, you can see the #1. It was recently published, and also the #0. It was released on the Free Comic Book Day, so you can actually get it in there. And it's interesting because you are playing in there with some elements that I find in common, in this case with Her Infernal Descent. And it is a way about how we perceive reality in this case. Can you tell us a little bit about Relay and how it starts?
Yeah, Relay is a big budget sort of sci-fi exploration of reality, of monoculture in particular. Looking at the best way to explain it is looking at humanity as if they became the Borg, going to other planets and assimilating other planets and building out a future in a certain set of ideals. However, as you get thrown into this world, very literally, you realize that these ideals aren't all they're cracked up to be. So the man who built out this monoculture, who built out this sort of reality, may have actually been a con man. And so you follow a character on a quest to find this legendary creator of the monoculture, the man who brought Earth the relay, the man who spread the relay out across the galaxy, and maybe a bunch of lies along the way.
And it's interesting because some of the reviews of the title mentioned that perhaps it feels a little bit about the like you have some Blade Runner references, but well, you have some Philip K. Dick's quotes actually at the beginning, I believe, of issue 1. But also I see something mystical and perhaps a more obvious reference in this case to 2001 from Stanley Kubrick, because well, after all, you have a huge monolith at the beginning, so so it's in there. Let me just find one of the pages to share with the audience so they have it. And this is actually from the issue number 0. And I was kind of surprised because obviously everything is related, but you don't need to read number 0 if in case that you just pick it number 1, the issue number 1 that was released last week. But I love the fact that you're exploring the story in different aspects, because also it's not only focused in our planet, because it revolves around even the entire universe, I believe, right? It's not only taking place in one place.
Yeah, and each issue is going to kind of travel to different planets and explore the kind of broader ramifications of this monoculture and how it's spreading out across the galaxy. I wanted to ensure that although it had a Free Comic Book Day issue on Free Comic Book Day this year, I didn't want that to be necessary reading. I didn't want people to be like, oh, I missed that issue and then I can't get into number 1. I wanted it to actually be a thing where if you read it, it's going to enhance your experience of number 1, but it's not going to be necessary. And the fun thing about the Free Comic Book Day issue is it actually comes back around in a big way in issue 4, which is not going to hit for a little while. But in issue 4, you go back to the planet that the 0 issue was set on, and you see how things changed.
And it's also part of, well, I am glad that you mentioned that. You heard it here first. You have now something to look forward at issue number 4. But I remember that in the case of issue number 1, the monolith actually has like a request that it's sort of even like a mantra, or we could say it, for the characters, and gives them something, some sort of motivation. And this is something that I love about here, because we have the different interpretation about the word from a higher power, in this case of the monolith, of the relay, and it's Fine Donaldson's word. So perhaps you can be like, perhaps the character from issue 1, if I remember correctly, he never mentions his name.
No, he does not, but that is him from issue 0.
You have it in there, and because I remember that he's presenting with some of the locals, if we can say it that way, and they are like, well, hi, I am X person, and they say my name, they say their name, and he's like, and I am an envoy from a different part, or something like that. And in this case, some of the characters in issue number 1, they are thinking more about, well, perhaps that's just a metaphor. Perhaps it doesn't. We're not looking for a specific person in this case. We're looking for something different. And you play with this because I believe that you can actually read only the lines or the dialogues of the people, and you cannot look at the pages, and perhaps you can have a very different idea of what's happening, because they are more an introspection. They are more discussing philosophical topics. Did you plan it this way? Did you plan it to be like some ideas that can be exchangeable perhaps?
Yeah, so I don't particularly like when sci-fi books are like, here's all the rules about how this world works, and here's all the things you need to know. I didn't want to start the book with a big exposition dump about what this monolith is, I thought it was way more interesting to literally throw you into the world. And you can actually see that on the second page of the book, where the main character literally gets thrown out of a car and falls into this world. That was done on purpose to ensure that you're not going to get your hand held in this book. This is going to be big sci-fi ideas in the vein of Philip K. Dick, in the vein of Ursula K. Le Guin, where you have to just be immersed in this and you have to wait, because these characters are not going to say, hey, this is how this world works. They're going to just live and breathe as they do. And if you continue with us on this journey, you're going to learn more along with them. But I'm not going to slow things down and be like, here's how everything works.
And well, if you want to perhaps to slow down the pace, don't worry, because at the end of the comic you actually have the description, in this case, of the characters. You can also look at some of the behind the scenes, we can say, about how it was created, part of the script in this case, so you can digest a little bit the storytelling that you're having in here. So we're pretty much getting to the end of this conversation. Let me just check if we have more questions from the audiences. Juan Paulo, he says hi. He's sending his greetings from Querétaro. Chris Mendoza also from Facebook, and Joel, he was with us from the very beginning. And I have one final question in this case, and it's related in this case to Relay. And perhaps it's one of the discussions that I usually have in this case, in some other situations with filmmakers. In this case, well, it's one question that I dare to ask you. Is Relay really science fiction? The scientific element is going to play with the story, or is more like fantasy that it's happening in the space?
It's probably a little bit more fantasy that's happening in space. It's more about the nature of this sort of reality rather than the hard science fiction facts behind it. I didn't want to get bogged down in the how and why this monolith works, because I didn't think that makes for compelling reading. You will learn how and why it works, but you're not going to learn the hard science of why.
Yeah, it's actually, unless you are really into hard science, and it can be a little bit hard to digest, if I can say it that way. So there we have it. And if people want to contact you, if they want to share comments, experiences, ideas for stories, no, actually those you shouldn't be sharing that. You should be writing your own ideas, guys. In this case, where they can contact you?
You can find me on Twitter at Zac B.E. Thompson. That's pretty much where I spend most of my day. So you can throw me photos of the stuff that you've read of mine, or throw me ideas, or just tell me that you hated everything I've written. Right there.
No. We actually like really a lot of the titles, and I actually have some homework to do. I don't want to pretend to be like, oh, I have read all your work, and I remember that I loved your first issue with Bloodshot or something like that. No. That's why we choose the titles that we're commenting in here, because it's something that we have actually read about your work. And once again, man, thank you very much. You are really killing it with either with the titles in the case of Relay that you're writing by yourself, or all the work that you have been doing also with Lonnie. Those are some of the best titles that you can find nowadays in the comic shelf. Remember, guys, that not everything is just Batman. I mean, Batman is doing great. Tom King, I want to interview you sometime, but there is some other stories in there. And something that I also love about your work in this case is that they feel more like a limited series, so you can actually have a complete ending. In this case, in Coming to Me, we already have it on the Drex. Hopefully we will get something there with the rest of the titles, so you can have the satisfaction of have an ending for the story. It's not something that goes all the way. So there you have it, people. Remember that they can contact in this case Zac in Twitter. If you find him as Zac B. Thompson. For my part, well, you can find me as Dan Campos. And remember that if you like it, this show, there's a way to support us. We have like the tip jar, to put it one way, and you can support us in our Patreon page, patreon.com/Churros y Palomitas, where we have different ideas to different projects. We have different shows that are related. In this case, we're having interviews with people that we really appreciate their work. And tomorrow, the audio downloadable version will be available from this show. And for my part, that was everything. Zac, once again, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me. This is awesome.
All right, and here comes the end credits. Thank you to all our patrons, because thanks to you, we're doing this.